Welcome to the latest in the College of Asia and the Pacific's Professorial Lecture Series. This was a series that we established last year to celebrate the extraordinary achievements of our newly appointed professors. And it has already been a really great success. This is the first time we've had one of these lectures in the Crawford building, though, so that's very good as far as I'm concerned. It's always good to move these things around the college. And of course, there's a reason why we're in the Crawford building, but we'll get to that shortly. My name's Helen Sullivan, and I have the very great privilege of being the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific and also a Professor of Public Policy here at the ANU. And as we begin, I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, pay my respects to elders past and present, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people with us this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge that the land on which we live and work was never ceded. So as I say, there's a reason why we are in the Crawford building this evening, and that's because we're celebrating Professor Shiro Armstrong's fantastic elevation to professorship here at the ANU. I've known Shiro for quite some time. And I know quite a lot about Shiro, actually, including I know how much credit he has on his ANU purchase card, which is a subject that we might want to talk about, Paul. But anyway, of course, Shiro is an outstanding scholar, an economist. He's the director of the Australia-Japan Research Centre, editor of East Asia Forum, and the director of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research. His research interests include Sino-Japan economic and political relations, East Asian economies and economic integration, and international trade and foreign direct investment. His lecture this evening will focus on a topic which one way or another is interesting to me as a public policy scholar. For I don't know however long since I'm a political sociologist, so therefore not recognised by economists, but that's a whole other conversation that we can have. And throughout pretty much the whole of my career, we've been having this debate about, the balance between economics and security. And for a long, long time in public policy, and those of you here from the public service, I know lived this, public policy was largely defined through an economic lens. And now all of a sudden, everything has become securitized. And for people like me who are neither economists nor international relations scholars or national security scholars, whichever you prefer, this is an interesting tension and something that, as far as I'm concerned, sidesteps the main issue. But that, I'm sure, will be something that Shiro will address in his lecture tonight, which focuses on the weaponisation of economics and restoring the global economic order, seeking to answer the question of how might the economic order be mended to help make countries more secure and better off economically. It is my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Shiro Armstrong to the lectern.
Well, thank you so much, Helen, for that really nice and warm introduction and welcome. It is really a delight to be here with so many friends in the audience, so many colleagues who I really admire. It's quite intimidating, but I've been told I should enjoy this, and hopefully I will. So, look, let me just start by also acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. So we're told and we're reminded every day that we're living in a more uncertain world, one that threatens both our economic and political security. Australia's prosperity and security depends on getting policy frameworks right domestically and getting those domestic strategies right. But only getting domestic strategies right is not enough in our more uncertain world. Crucially, we also need to understand our external environment and craft the most effective international economic diplomacy towards it. So this is a subject I want to talk about tonight. Australia's prosperity and economic security depend first and foremost on ideas about the most effective strategies to achieve them and the capability of our national institutions to deliver them. The ANU, where I've studied and to which I've dedicated my career, has been the source of many of those ideas. And my predecessors here have worked closely with our national government to realise them. Chief among our government institutions in this context is a strong Treasury Department, with its input into economic policy making that anchors rigorous calculation of Australia's national interests. Australia's institutions of macroeconomic management and economic strategies have helped the Australian economy outperform most of the advanced economies around the world for decades, and that has been a crucial source of Australia's security. A strong Treasury with clear and robust frameworks for assessing the national interest is crucial to holding the line on bad policies in national government. It's welcome, therefore, that Australia's Treasurer, Dr. Jim Chalmers, and Treasury Secretary, Dr. Stephen Kennedy, have articulated a new national interest framework in the context of major changes to Australia's external circumstances. Their recent speeches highlight the elevation of economic security considerations in national policy and emphasise the need to respond to what's going on in the changing world we live in. The Treasurer points to changes in policies in other countries and international uncertainty to justify increased government participation in the market for a future made in Australia strategy and a new economic security posture. Dr. Kennedy threads a needle in integrating security considerations into economic policy and draws a line that urges a limit to security interest mission creep, something that has been missing in Australian policy discussion to date. In his speech, Dr. Kennedy discusses three aspects of what might be a sound and proportionate response to global developments. The first, a small yard, high fence approach to genuinely critical infrastructure and technology. Second, delivering more resilient domestic supply chains through highly tailored responses. And third, playing our role in strengthening global supply chains. These are important aspects of economic security strategy. But no role is assigned in his discussion to international economic diplomacy when it's been the changes to Australia's external circumstances that are driving these national policy responses. The national argument, therefore, is incomplete. So my primary purpose is to consider this incompleteness in the argument and to set out the tools and arrangements that we have at our command to respond most effectively to the problems that we now face as a nation. On the three aspects of Australia's response to changed economic circumstances that Dr. Kennedy mentions, I'd simply note 2 points. First is I too would like to underline his important warning about mission creep. The second is that the national interest framework, which includes an economic resilience and security stream and a net zero transformation stream, the latter is aimed at making Australia a renewable energy superpower by focus on supporting and realising Australia's comparative advantage in internalising externalities in renewable energy. That's sound policy, especially when Australia doesn't have a price on carbon. There are other issues in the economic resilience and security stream of the national interest framework that are essential to consider if we as a nation are to develop sound policy responses to the problems they intend to address. So in this lecture, I want to review the issues more fully, drawing on the intellectual arguments that are important to getting policy strategies right for Australia's national circumstances. I think first, it's important to make clear what has changed in the world and identify Australia's priorities in responding to these changes. What are the new geopolitical risks that have raised global uncertainty, and how specifically do they affect Australia? And importantly, what has not changed? In doing so, I identify the international economic tools that can be deployed to achieve security objectives. This element in the armoury of instruments to achieve national security has been neglected, but for a middle power like Australia, it's crucial to our security priorities. There's a need to fill this gap and spell out the international instruments, arrangements and agency that Australia can deploy to reduce political risk and enhance its economic security. Addressing this omission will begin to define a more complete and credible approach to Australia's national economic and security strategy, one that once more puts robust strategic economic diplomacy at its forefront. So my main message in this lecture has two simple and complementary parts. First, Australia is obviously not alone in this circumstance, and all our partners in East Asia, both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, with whom our national economy and its future are so deeply intertwined, are locked into a similar destiny. And second, in this company, although sharing a now much vaunted vulnerability, we have agency and leverage regionally that deserves proper exploration in our national interest and in the interests of regional stability and prosperity. The Treasurer and Treasury Secretary's speeches are a particularly welcome foray into territory that has been for too long uncharted by economic policymakers. Australian policy has appeared to be adrift, with national security considerations increasingly affecting economic policy without constraint or clear logic. Without articulation of a framework to guide policy development, policies from successive governments that restrict foreign investment, that call for diversification of trade partners, that favour trusted economic partners and push increased government involvement in supply chains and the market are among the reactive policy impulses that have recently gathered favour. These policy measures are now fashionable in other countries, driven by the trend in major advanced economies in a more uncertain global environment and amid the return of geopolitics. How much these policy measures are driven by such concerns and indeed help to address them, or driven by much more deep-seated problems that relate to parochialism and protectionism, remains an open question. So, what has changed in Australia's new economic and security circumstance? Both the Treasurer and Treasury Secretary point to a changing world. What is important to framing the correct policy response to these changes, of course, is being absolutely clear about what exactly has changed, what has not changed, and calibrating national policy changes to the new global realities, not some chimera that does not reflect the priorities with which we have to actually deal. So the first big change, of course, is a big global change that China is much larger. That was always likely to happen, and bluntly, we have to get used to it. It's also likely that Indonesia and India and other populous countries will become significantly economically and therefore politically much larger relative to us and the United States. In the next 25 years, India is likely to have an economy larger than that of the United States if it too does moderately well. There are some implications we have to think through, but having to do that was always going to be part of our future. The change in structure of global power and wealth already is so profound that hankering for a unipolar world is no longer credible. Managing the risks of rivalry in this new multipolar world is now a primary objective of policy choice. For Australia, the rise of China is related to these new global circumstances, geopolitical circumstances, that include broadly 5 adverse developments. Our largest economic partner now being in strategic competition with our most important security ally. Second, a more assertive China with a trend towards political centralisation. Third, an increasing inward-looking United States that has gone from enforcer to spoiler of the multilateral trading system. Fourth, an uncertain global response to accelerating climate change. And fifth, paralysis in global forums that contribute to the often cited polycrisis in international affairs that now includes, of course, dangerous wars in Gaza and Ukraine. In such a world, the security imperative has begun to dominate the economic imperative in many countries, though the two are intertwined. Australia has also strengthened its national security response to this more uncertain world. Nobody doubts the crucial role national security agencies play in keeping Australia safe and in upholding the security of the nation. It's the job of security agencies to identify security risks, including whatever existential risks there may be. Existential tail risks may have low probability, but they have an infinite price. That is, no amount of prosperity is worth the risk of catastrophic security outcomes. So as economists, we're used to probability estimates that emerge from well-understood statistical theory. The probability of estimates of war that come from the national security community, however, are not of this nature. And there is a danger in taking the idea of a confidently asserted estimate of the probability of war as a serious quantitative estimate and applying it to our cost-benefit analyses on that basis. It's notable that in the West, that it is the West, not the emerging markets, that are trying to dismantle the global trade regime and globalisation. Because the thinking appears to be that will help us slow or reverse the shift in wealth and power away from us to them. This strategy will almost certainly fail, not only because of the shift in power is already so large as to make the old post-Cold War order unsustainable, but also because the perennial domestic allure of protectionism that will make us poorer and weaker has now been turbocharged with xenophobic national security narratives. So it's important to be clear on an integrated response that doesn't move us to a corner solution that risks prosperity. A former official or unnamed source from the security community should not automatically be taken as accepted authority on these security risks. Because Australia really is a lucky country in terms of proximity and distance. We benefit from relative proximity to East Asia, which has for decades been the fastest growing component of global trade and incomes. And we've benefited from the policies that have helped unleash forces of economic gravity to fuel our own prosperity and security. Only absolute distance matters so much for military security. And Australia is blessed by distance from flashpoints of such military risks in Asia. Australia, like any other country, however, is of course within missile range and potential target of large-scale cyber attacks, and it pays its dues to its alliance relationships. For the most part, though, the hard-headed reality is that distance means entering a war is more within Australia's choice and would depend on the particular circumstances as to whether Australia would choose to join a war, for example, against China. The front line in Australia's response to China has been responding to China's economic coercion. That was a diplomatic priority for the previous Australian government and a rallying call in its dealings with the G7 and other advanced industrial democracies. It was identified as a major threat to Australia's economic security that is now driving the departure from many decades of economic policy consensus that delivered prosperity and security. The Treasury Secretary points out that China is a top trading partner of over 140 countries, including being by far Australia's largest trading partner. Last year, at $317 billion, China accounted for 30% of Australia's two-way trade, while all G7 countries, including the United States, accounted for 26%. In 2020, that interdependence was weaponised by China via the economic coercion it sought to exert over political differences with Australia. Learning the right lessons from that experience is important in formulating the policy response. China's attempted economic coercion against Australia in 2020 failed both economically and politically. Whatever Beijing's intentions were, the episode created substantial political blowback for China, and repairing trust will take time. The economic weapons that China deployed against Australia were blunted by the multilateral trading system, which, for whatever its weaknesses, allowed Australian exporters to first find alternative markets, but also second, ultimately seek redress through the threat of international legal processes against China. These trade coercive measures would have inflicted significant economic damage in a world of closing markets and fewer alternative buyers and sellers. That was the world of beggar thy neighbour protectionism in the 1930s, where trade restrictions fed aggression, insecurity, and ultimately war. We cannot take what we have now with open global trade markets for granted, and it should be a primary policy objective to preserve openness. Contestable markets raise the cost of intervening in them, they dilute economic leverage and thwart the exercise of market power. Contestable markets reduce our vulnerability to other powers. The multilateral trading system, with the World Trade Organization at its core, remains fundamental to Australia's prosperity and economic and political security. This is not simply because it can limit the exercise of power against Australia itself via trade coercion, but also because it's fundamental to all of Australia's major trading partners and their economic and political security in the region. A breakdown in confidence in the multilateral trading system would unravel economic and political ties globally, but especially in this part of the world, in East Asia, where political cooperation is still underdone and economic cooperation has been shaped significantly by the ambitions for development and its natural consequence, a necessary international economic interdependence. A major immediate problem with the WTO, however, is that the dispute settlement system has been rendered ineffective by the United States' exercise of veto power over the appointment of judges to its appellate body. The United States has neutered the WTO's dispute settlement system to avoid being held account by world trade rules. A workaround measure that has kept the dispute settlement process working has seen 53 other WTO members, almost a third of the WTO membership, join a multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement, another long acronym, MPIA, a plurilateral framework which duplicates the appellate body, enabling members to resolve WTO disputes among themselves. MPIA was initiated by the European Union and Canada, but Australia and China were both founding members 4 months after the appellate body ceased functioning in December 2019. China has a substantial stake in the established system of trade rules, and despite its trade sanctions against Australia and some other countries, has a demonstrated preference for enforceable rules, including through its membership of MPIA. China's track record in the WTO, in the number of cases against it, and its acceptance of rulings in black and white on the WTO website is better than that of either the United States or European Union. China's getting better, of course, at navigating and gaming the system, just like other members, and many of the problems originate in domains where the WTO rules are outdated or simply missing, and China's actions create large spillovers for the rest of the world. China's circumstance as the world's largest trading nation, a nation without any major formal allies, means that it is deeply dependent on the system that helps manage its trade exposure for its economic and political security. Australia and the region's economic and security interests lie in sustaining Chinese dependence on that system and maintenance of that multilateralist posture. What has not changed then, although to some it may appear to have, is the value, relevance and importance of the rules-based multilateral trading system to the global community and to Australia, and the security that it still provides. So this is not some faint-hearted hope, this is the crux of what has recently served to defend Australia's economic security. The global trade regime is still a reference point against protectionism, and the open global trading system with substitute markets and alternative suppliers is what protects us and other markets against shocks, politically motivated or otherwise, including Europe from the big political shock that severed energy trade with Russia. The WTO's dispute settlement system, with all its problems, provided the exit ramp for Australia and China from that episode of economic coercion. So realistically, it needs to be acknowledged that the United States is in retreat as a leader in the rules-based trade and is becoming a disruptor of that system. Gone are the days when the United States gained influence in our region by offering the promise of prosperity to those willing to follow the rules of an open global trading system. Worse, the United States is now undermining that system for those who still depend upon it. The good news is those countries that remain within its compass comprise most of the rest of the world, and their share of the world economy is growing. Middle powers are increasingly shaping the global economic order, and this provides Australia with an important opportunity. Under the first Trump administration, the United States invoked the WTO security exception to justify higher tariffs on imported steel and aluminium. As the WTO panel ruled in December 2022, there was no emergency in international affairs, international relations to justify the national security exception for Trump's steel tariffs. Having lost the case, the United States appealed into the void of the non-functioning WTO appellate body. The Biden administration doubled down on Trump's national security tariffs, with US Trade Representative Catherine Tai trashing the WTO ruling. We shouldn't underestimate the hardening bipartisan consensus in Washington on this. Increasing use of this Article 21 security exception in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade has the potential to rip a hole in the centre of the global trading order. For the increasing list of goods and services that are designated as having dual use or having both civilian and military applications, the rules will offer very little defence against protectionism. The policy priority for Australia that is crucial to add to the new national interest framework is trade regime defence and multilateral trade system reform. This policy priority is not merely multilateral, it is also at the core of regional economic diplomatic initiative. The list of countries joining MPIA is slowly growing. That's that workaround for the appellate body, with Japan joining last year and the Philippines joining this year. And the security exception hole needs to be plugged. The WTO, which underpins the multilateral trading system, is not working perfectly, but it remains crucial to Australian global economic security. Great power rivalry doesn't mean the end of a level playing field and equal treatment in international affairs. It means that the most favoured nation principle is more important than ever to provide economic security. These are the principles that are to be sought and sustained wherever it is practical. Friendshoring and measures that favour trade with trusted partners contradict the MFN principle. The alternative is a world ruled by political might and competing blocs, one that would be considerably less prosperous and more threatening and insecure, with consequences in terms of political instability detrimental to Australia's security interests. This assessment is no starry-eyed nostalgia for the past. For a small open economy like Australia, a multipolar world means finding domains, whether in investment, technology, climate, migration, or geographic spheres, where large powers have an interest in developing and enforcing rules. These interests are shared by middle powers and open economies, both of which are heavily concentrated in East Asia. Australia is not alone in its region or globally in this multilateral mission. ASEAN, Japan, South Korea are all aligned to the same objective. The United States is likely to be a major source of trade policy uncertainty for the foreseeable future, but the rest of the world relies on a rules-based global economic order that tilts towards a level playing field and equal treatment. Keeping the rest of the world open and committed to the rules-based trading system is a very high priority. For no region is this more true than the highly integrated and trade-exposed East Asian region that has most to lose from a breakdown in the established international trading system. Many countries have come to see high trade shares as a vulnerability and they're trying to diversify away from their fundamental comparative advantage and economies of scale in international markets. That makes countries poorer and likely makes them less secure and fails to recognise what has not changed in the global economy. Choosing such a path leads to a reinforcing downward spiral where countries increasingly turn inwards because of the actions of each other. The collective bargain of mutually reinforcing prosperity through open trade reverses with escalating protectionist interests. Policies that diversify away from interdependence and high trade shares because of the threat of weaponisation will not only make Australia poorer, they're likely to make Australia less safe and less secure. Economic analysis is important to identify that the risks of war and benefits of peace are not independent. And when economic strategies might be exploited to reduce security risk. Diplomacy can reduce the risk of war, particularly by facilitating deeper economic and social interests and understanding across borders. War or peace is not a gamble where the odds are fixed or risks of war only increase as the shift in relative economic or political power of protagonists change, potential protagonists change. While some may believe the risk of war grows inevitably with the Chinese economy in power, there are other factors which will reduce that risk. For example, the more China trades with the rest of the world, the more it would lose from disruptions that war would cause. That constraint doesn't eliminate the prospect of war, but it does make it much more costly, particularly in the case of economies like China's. The most enlightened states throughout history have understood this. Economics and security have always been entwined in the service of each other. The main elements of the global economic order today were forged in the middle of the Second World War at Bretton Woods. Economic and security challenges were tightly enmeshed in the thinking that led to its creation. Trade strategies in particular have been historically directed to securing peace, sometimes called the commercial peace, as in the European project or the political rapprochement forged by economic interdependence in Northeast Asia. That equilibrium among Northeast Asian countries was generated by their all eventually signing on to the post-war rules-based trade regime that binds the major powers together despite their long-standing political disagreements and rivalry. By contrast, there's been no similar economic engagement or political rapprochement between India and Pakistan in South Asia and in some other parts of the world. The great debates about trade and peace date back to at least the 18th century. In 1748, Montesquieu famously argued peace is a natural effect of trade, an argument extended by John Stuart Mill a century later, with evidence from throughout history. Adam Smith argued in The Wealth of Nations in 1776 that commerce between nations ought to be a source of peace, but it can in fact be, quote, the most fertile source of discord and animosity, end quote. Again, there is evidence of this throughout history and in contemporary US-China relations. What determines the relationship between trade and security is the nature of the regime within which countries engage economically. The post-war trade and economic order, with its organising principle of most favoured nation treatment and disciplines on discrimination, was indeed framed to constrain the exercise of raw political power in the conduct of international commerce. It is consistent with the overarching principles of post-war political order embedded in the United Nations Charter. Over the almost 80 years since its foundation, it has built global prosperity and a significant measure of peace among the nations that signed on to its rules through deepening international integration. The perception that those who support a rules-based economic order are beholden to commercial interests and neglect security risks is naive. Trade and economic interdependence have been a cause for peace in East Asia, Australia included. This was by design. So what might an external strategy be for Australia's economic security? The assumption underlying Australia's new economic security policies is that we are operating in a world in which international trade rules and arrangements have no role to play. That's what's missing in the new national interest framework. An unspecified country, China, is playing totally unfair in the global economic system to grow its global trade share, risking Australia's and global economic security. The message is that the abuse of market power should be viewed through a security lens. A favoured strategy is to de-risk critical minerals trade with China and to de-risk from Chinese supply chains, leading to reduced trade shares and, with government help, to develop trusted markets and suppliers. The costs are not assessed, but that strategy on the evidence we have will be very costly. It is noteworthy that this is a strategy very much in keeping with the stated national policy interests of the United States, despite the US and Australian economies and their trade structures being very different. The question here is, does this strategy make Australia safer or reduce risks from China? One of the most important security objectives served by an open and rules-based trading order is to reassure rising powers that they will have access to basic raw materials they need. Policies that divert trade, on the other hand, serve to increase paranoia and to strengthen the conviction that political pressure or military force alone can secure access to necessary markets. Australia's trade war with Japan in the 1930s helped to heighten Japanese economic insecurity, instead of, as Sir John Crawford argued at the time, trading Japanese economic security objectives for Australian political security. Instead, we bolstered Japanese nationalists. Australia's relationship with China is one of high-level interdependence, not just asymmetric dependence by a smaller country on a superpower that it's shown its willingness to abuse perceived economic leverage. Australia is indispensable to China's economic security. China has no substitute for Australian iron ore in quality or quantity that must supply over half its steel industry for more than a decade at least. Australia is heavily dependent on its large resources trade with China, not just to sustain its international spending power, but also for its substantial contributions to national revenues. To disengage from this huge trade relationship will be very costly for Australia and for China. Australia's economic interests in China are thus quite different from those of other developed countries. While the United States and Europe may feel threatened by China pushing out the technological frontier, Australia and the world more generally benefits from it. Cheaper, higher quality electric vehicles are unequivocally good for Australia and Australian consumers, since we make none of them, even as the European Union and the United States impose tariffs, in the US case now already at 100%, on imports of Chinese EVs. For very sound economic reasons, Australia provides significant inputs for industrial production in China, rather than competes with industrial outputs from it. China's strong comparative advantage in green machines, solar panels, wind turbines and EVs is mirrored by increasing comparative disadvantage in sectors where we happen to benefit, the export of green goods that embody green inputs. From a security perspective, it makes little sense for a small open economy to distance itself from a larger one likely to be a leader across many future technologies. This is especially so in technologies that help with the energy transition. Countries ranging from Japan to China itself deliberately and successfully sought engagement with whichever country was ahead of them technologically, so they could develop economically and become more secure, whether they were rivals or not. Similarly, a strategy that builds interdependence with China in critical minerals and close cooperation with China in the massive transformation that will need to take place in its steel-making technology over the coming decades to achieve decarbonisation goals via the input of green energy is likely to contribute to Australian prosperity and security, not detract from it. More iron and steel trade interdependence and more production of critical minerals in Australia make us more secure while serving our economic interests. Australia's resource trade continues to contribute to regional security, not detract from it. Chinese investment is important for making lithium hydroxide in Australia, for example. And we need to regain our confidence in regulating foreign investment, especially from China. To ensure such ventures succeed, I'll just keep going, I think. There are economic and security benefits that derive from welcoming Chinese investment, if properly regulated, like any other investment, domestic or foreign, instead of turning it away, which is what Australia has done over the past decade. The risks of economic coercion or misuse of assets and profits can be managed within the framework of Australian domestic laws, can be managed bilaterally with China, and most importantly and concurrently, multilaterally through regional and global arrangements. That interdependence could once again cushion Australia's economic performance in the next global economic downturn. The small yard, high fence contention is that there are a number of small goods that warrant protection even at a high cost. And that this will somehow help free up other domains for economic engagement. There are ways to achieve that security objective, there are other ways to achieve that security objective, including ways that do not involve trade or investment discrimination. China's integration into complex global supply chains that reach deep into the Chinese domestic market is a constraint on China's economic and political action. A Chinese economy and society that is less integrated into the global economy is one that brings more international political risks, not less. An economic question of political consequence is whether the global economy is on a trajectory towards a 1930s-style epic fail equilibrium, a generalised prisoner's dilemma where everyone is made worse off by narrowly self-interested national decisions, even if better outcomes are possible from cooperative international decisions, driven by US-China strategic competition and beggar-thy-neighbour policies brought on by short-sightedness in major economies. Dr. Kennedy argues that, quote, we are facing a more contested, more fragmented and more challenging global environment, end quote. The situation appears to be deteriorating. The world he describes is a world made by policy choice, not one exogenous to policy influence. And Australia is not, nor should it be, a passive bystander in that world. It's a world on that trajectory because of decisions in Washington, Beijing, and other capitals that of their nature are not all embracing, and purposeful actors in the global community can alter that trajectory by deliberate policy choice. Even in such a world, the choice of openness is a viable option. International markets can be a source of resilience if shocks are managed within a robust and flexible domestic macroeconomic framework. International economic diplomacy aimed at keeping markets open and contestable in our part of the world helps build foundational resilience in Australia. It's the flexible exchange rate, the dynamic markets at home with macroeconomic policies that target full employment which help us manage these shocks and risks. Australia, as a middle power, clearly cannot single-handedly alter the trajectory of world affairs. So what influence can Australia realistically bring to bear on its external environment to make it more congenial to its critical economic security interests? An important fact, to which I've referred earlier, of course, is that the heavy concentration of Australia's trade and economic interests are in its region. And that also defines our primary theatre of policy initiative and action. The East Asian region accounts for 67% of all of Australia's foreign trade, compared with 17% with our trusted Five Eyes allies and friends, or 26% with the G7 industrialised economies. Australian exports to ASEAN were $86.2 billion last year, Australia's third largest market behind China and Japan, and much larger than 33.6 billion Australia exports to the United States, and bigger than our total exports to the European Union. Total trade with ASEAN was $143.8 billion, making it Australia's second most important trading partner after China. While the United States may have other theatres of interest, East Asia is Australia's primary theatre of leverage and action. Australia has agency in the international economic order through its global initiatives at the WTO, at the G20, and as a first mover with MPIA. But it has particular leverage because of its prominent role and diplomatic standing in the region. Australia, as a small open economy and middle power politically, has helped with the input of ideas and the persuasion of our neighbours to engage with them to influence its external circumstances for the better. Australia has a track record in the region with intellectual leadership and deft economic diplomacy in the establishment of APEC, which includes China and the United States, and more recently the negotiation of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes China, and the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that as yet includes neither of the great powers. Australia has more agency than its economic weight would imply because through these arrangements and independently, the structure and strategic importance of its trade yields close alignments to the interests and diplomatic opportunity with a highly interdependent set of regional economies that account for around 30% of the global economy and 30% of global trade. Obviously, if Australia were to mismanage this diplomacy and retreat from free and open trade, it would also risk accelerating the fragmentation of the global economic order, a culpability that it can be said to have shared in the treatment of Japan at the League of Nations in 1919 and in its trade policies later during the interwar period. A priority for Australia is to work to defend and strengthen the rules to avoid abuse of international market power, especially in the primary theatre of its economic interests. This is the vital second front of diplomacy for Australia's national security strategy. Our alliance relationships are the first front in national security strategy. Without initiative on the second front, the risk of military conflict that ends in tears and ashes will be higher. The global regime that helped Australia build its prosperity with high trade shares with its neighbours in Northeast Asia has been weakened and is under threat, but is far from dead. Australia does not have to reconstruct the whole castle of international law and norms to protect the moat around it. The primary line of defence is in Asia, where Australia has agency, contributing to regional rules that enmesh China in ASEAN-centred arrangements and taking seriously and probing thoroughly Chinese intentions to sign up to existing arrangements can help. The alternative is not a safer world. Loss of confidence in the multilateral trading system is leading countries and companies to self-insure with diversification, stockpiling, friendshoring, onshoring of production, and other policy measures in the name of economic security. These are third best policy responses in a second best world that reduce our chances of reaching the first best solution. The idea of trusted partners is a misunderstanding of the role of trust in economic interactions. The great benefit of markets is that they reduce the need for interpersonal trust. Before we had widespread markets, a blacksmith in a rural village had to trust the farmer for whom he repaired ploughs and hoes on credit that they would repay him when the grain harvest came in. Pay him in grain when the harvest came in. Now, communist countries who conducted international trade on barter terms had to do something similar. One of the reasons they traded so little, and especially for smaller countries, on such bad terms. When markets are thick, on the other hand, we trust in the rules of the game and the power of markets rather than the participants. Competition crowds out strategic behaviour with alternative buyers and suppliers. Also, when you have a good tennis umpire, you don't need to trust the person on the other side of the net when they tell you they think your volley was out. It's both the markets and the rules that protect us. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Australia also found itself asking whether it could trade with countries it did not trust. Chief among them was Japan, still then a recent enemy. Rather than give in to the temptation to trade only with trusted partners, Australia signed the 1957 treaty with Japan that normalised trade relations and helped drive Australia's post-war economic expansion. Trust was a consequence of trade, not its cause. Day-to-day decisions by the government require a nuanced, risk-based approach to balancing prosperity and security, and in some instances, a difficult trade-off between security and prosperity. But without a clear priority on the longer-term strategy of preserving policy space in a multilateral rules-based economic system, Australia will be a price taker in a smaller world heading towards a corner solution of stagnant growth and the incapacity to provide hard security. Benign globalisation and a benign international environment was not a lucky accident. It was created by the rules and a regime forged with a proactive diplomacy and Australia at the table at the dying stages of the Second World War, and then for decades through patient diplomacy designed to deepen and entrench it. The multilateral system created then and subsequently extended still diffuses economic and political power, but it appears now missing from the framing of Australia's economic security strategy. Regardless of the external environment, everything we want to achieve will be harder without the institutional framework that multilateral system provides. Every time the system is weakened, our set of policy options narrows. The Treasurer argued that a future made in Australia does not mean a future made alone. And Dr. Kennedy acknowledged the nature of the new multipolar world, where the G7 industrial economies account for a much smaller proportion of global output and power. We cannot sensibly afford reliance that depends only on the G7 plus advanced economies for partnerships in new areas like critical minerals. The BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, is now larger than the G7 in economic weight in purchasing power parity terms, and emerging market economies are becoming more important. There's a need for more policy attention on the emerging markets beyond China and India. Southeast Asia is a particular blind spot in Australia's global economic diplomacy, despite its being on Australia's strategic front line. Putting policy effort into working with trusted suppliers and partners is a limited response to our national economic security objectives. Working with partners facing similar forces to develop rules and norms that provide collective security is more likely to deliver dividends. The clear-eyed assessment must be that the heightened risks to the global economic order that we face have more than one origin and a one-dimensional defensive strategy, that if not complemented by a proactive diplomatic strategy, will lead our country in the wrong direction, weakening national economic strength and security. Australia has agency and has neighbours looking to engage with leadership in keeping the region open, stable and secure. The only way to do so is within the most pertinent coalitions, collectively and multilaterally. The incorporation of security interests in economic policy in Australia risks making Australia poorer in the name of national security. It may also risk making Australia less safe and less secure, creating a more uncertain world, especially as the United States moves towards friendshoring as well as isolation much more rapidly than we had hoped. A reframing of Australia's economic strategy towards a smaller world for Australia limits Australian strategic policy space, reduces options for traders, for example, barley growers cut out of Chinese markets, and limits Australia's influence in its own region and in global forums, and is hardly likely to advance Australia's economic or political security objectives. In conclusion, Australia became the richest country in the world in per capita terms in the 19th century. It did so by specialising in areas of comparative advantage, particularly land-extensive agriculture and minerals, initially wool and gold. Federation brought wider and deeper domestic markets, but also a turn towards protectionism that stunted growth and left Australia more dependent on its traditional protector and economic partner, Great Britain, itself an economic power in decline. What made Australia rich again was the late 20th century turn towards openness, and as a consequence, finding its economic place in Asia. Today, the apparent trajectory of the global economy and increased geopolitical uncertainties are causing a retreat from the ideas and principles that have so successfully guided the pursuit of our national interests for the past half century or more, towards economic policies that encourage more self-sufficiency against external vulnerabilities, a shift away from natural comparative advantage towards trade with so-called trusted partners, and implicit discrimination in trade and investment strategies that have the potential to deliver our nation a poorer, less prosperous future. Underpinning all of these problems in one way or another is the inevitable logic that global public goods, such as maintaining peace, responding to climate change, or opening international trade, are much harder to deliver in our new multipolar world. But retreating to focus only on national responses instead of how to deal with the realities of the world as it is risks making Australia poorer and less secure. I return to the important role that the ANU and Treasury need to play in today's more uncertain world. Australia may be a small open economy and middle power politically, but it can be a leader in its theatre of influence and interest in East Asia. That is where Australia will find agency to protect its national and global interests. Thank you.